So welcome to ARMA International's webinar, Why Effective Information Governance is Essential to Reducing the Costs and Risks of eDiscovery. Today's webinar is sponsored by the great folks at NetGovern. I'm Ann Snyder, Manager of Content Development at ARMA International, and I will be your host and moderator for this webinar. For those of you who have attained your IGP, the Information Governance Professional Certification, today's webinar counts toward 1 continuing education credit in the legal category. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to ask in the Q&A box. We are unlikely to get to all questions, but will respond to any remaining questions received after the webinar has concluded. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to take care of. First up is professional membership. If you haven't checked out your membership benefits lately, we are excited to offer online and virtual opportunities to connect and get resourced through your membership. If you aren't an ARMA professional member, as you can see, there are a lot of resources to take advantage of, and it's an affordable way to get resourced as an information professional. More information about ARMA membership and getting started can be found at our website at arma.org. ARMA InfoCon 2020. InfoCon is scheduled for this fall. We're actively modeling a virtual option, but are still planning on another premier event. Visit ARMA's website for additional details on education tracks and our no-risk registration policy, addressing options for refunds and adjustments for event cancellation and postponement and alternative scenarios. You can register now for the lowest rates. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. First, I would like to say that I'm especially excited to have Andrea and Tara joining us today. That does not detract in any way from Frederick. Not only are Andrea and Tara two incredibly accomplished and experienced attorneys, truly working at the leading edge of law and technology issues, as you'll hear in a second, but I have also had the personal privilege of calling each of them colleague at one time or another in my career, and I am personally grateful that both of them have agreed to be with us today. First up, Andrea. Andrea is a partner in the New York office of Norton Rose Fulbright and is the U.S. head of eDiscovery and information governance. Her practice focuses on data privacy, eDiscovery, cross-border discovery, and cybersecurity. She counsels clients, among other things, on navigating foreign privacy law while complying with U.S. discovery obligations. She's an adjunct professor at Temple and William and Mary Law Schools, where she teaches classes in eDiscovery. She was recently appointed to the steering committee of the Sedona Conference Working Group on Electronic Document Retention and Production. She's a member of the working groups on cross-border discovery and data privacy and cybersecurity. Up next, Tara Lawler. She is a partner in the Philadelphia office of Morgan Lewis Bacchius, LLP, in the e-data practice. Morgan was in the cutting edge of handling data with a special practice group. I hope Tara can tell us a little bit more about that during today's webinar. Her practice focuses on eDiscovery, information management, and data privacy. She counsels clients on various preservation, collection, and data processing, document review, and production-related strategies. Her primary focus is on product liability and toxic tort cases, as well as commercial and white-collar litigation. Frederick Bouget is the Chief Technology Officer at NetGovern. In his role at NetGovern, Frederick takes care of product vision. He studied engineering physics and started his career at Matrox, where he took part in defining one of the first small business internet routers. He went on to join Marconi in optical communication and worked on the optical data revolution. He joined NetGovern, then NetMail in 2008. He's spoken on numerous conferences around the world on topics ranging from optical networks to enterprise policies and eDiscovery. I'd like to welcome everyone today. And if you'd like to say a few words, please do.
Just happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to sponsor this webinar, so thank you, Ann.
Thank you. ARMA is incredibly grateful for the financial support that makes programming like this possible. When choosing business partners and solutions for your information programs, we hope that you'll give extra consideration to the solution providers who continue to invest in you, solution providers like NetGovern. So today we're going to talk about the downstream effects of poor IG on eDiscovery, the costs, risks, and business disruption that can result, as well as the converse side of that, the impact of effective information governance on improving eDiscovery. How having your information housed in order, having it organized can help you keep the costs, risks, and disruption in check. And then we're going to look at how you can leverage the gaps that you've identified during the eDiscovery process to improve your IG programs. But of course, eDiscovery is only one use of your organization's information. The gaps that you identify there are necessarily impacting the rest of your organizational uses of information. We'll next open it up for a quick word from NetGovern, and then open it up to a Q&A with our panelists. Most of you are undoubtedly familiar with the concept of discovery. During litigation or other investigations, is the process of identifying and locating information, preserving it and reviewing it, processing it, and as appropriate, producing it to the other side. Some have likened it to finding a needle in a haystack, but eDiscovery specifically refers to the discovery of electronically stored information, or ESI, which you can see here has a very broad definition. And because of the volume, variety, speed, with which it's created, as well as the various technical complexities associated with eDiscovery, it presents additional challenge that may make you feel that it's more like this kind of a process of finding the relevant information. Do you have anything to add on this before I move on, Andrea and Tara?
I was just going to say, it's eDiscovery is really discovery, right? Even when we get paper documents these days, we end up scanning them and OCRing them so that we can work with them electronically. So it's really important to have some skills in this area, and particularly even if you're doing information governance, to sort of understand the challenges around it.
Mm-hmm. So this next picture here is the electronic discovery reference model, or EDRM, and you can see in this graphic that IG is to the left or upstream from eDiscovery in the model. And why I'm air quoting here is just to challenge this downstream, upstream, right, left dichotomy. And even the model itself is meant to be conceptual. It's not meant exactly to be linear or a true waterfall approach. The ideal is that we should be taking a more holistic approach to our information. And you can see in here on the eDiscovery side of this, the different steps, the identification, preservation, collection of information, and then the steps that tend to be very time and labor intensive: processing, review, and analysis, eventual production, and then presentation to the other side. And you may even think of some information when Tara and I were talking about this webinar in preparation for it, the sort of issues relating to governing your the data that's produced during discovery itself. That has to be part of your information governance strategy. You'll also notice on here, and I think this is relevant to some of the costs associated with eDiscovery that we're going to get into, is this yellow triangle, that starts to the far left in the diagram and gets smaller as you move from the left to over toward relevance. Volume is a major issue in terms of the costs associated with eDiscovery, but how you're discovering, how you're controlling your information, including what's going on in that circular area, that's the IG part of it, how well it's organized will also have an impact on these things. So when we were talking about the appropriate metaphor for this, for what's going on here, we were thinking about eDiscovery as receiving these downstream consequences of the upstream IG decisions, with digital detritus and the other consequences of bad decisions sort of flowing downstream to eDiscovery. Or another image that came up was this concept of the digital hoarder, where you have to sort of Marie Kondo that information before you can find anything from an eDiscovery perspective. Does anyone on the panel have any comments on this before I?
Right. Yeah. So I do think that I really like the hoarder analogy here, and I think it is important to. IG is important because managing your data and getting rid of data that you no longer need. There's no business need for it. It's not subject to an ongoing record retention schedule. Keeping it And a lot of people will say, well, storing data is cheap nowadays, so we can just keep it. It's not a real big cost to us. And it's not, right? Until you need to go get it because of litigation or an investigation requirement, right? And then if you're just not enforcing your record retention schedule, you're not requiring employees to go through their emails and managing their mailbox. And there's this explosion of mailbox sizes. 10 years ago, a mailbox size was 100 megabytes or 1 gigabyte. And now, we're up in the cloud and there's 500 gigabytes of mail. And so if you're not enforcing these changes and these business decisions, you're going to have a stockpile of data, which might be cheap to store, but then when you have to go find it and collect it and then process it, review it, that's what the concern is. So sort of making sure you're not hoarding data that no longer has any utility to your company. Important.
I think we may even started touching on some of the bits of the point of my first question. You said, what are the some of the major ways in which poor IG upstream or not having that digital house in order can increase the cost of eDiscovery? Andrea, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, well, Tara's absolutely right. The volumes are just so much bigger, and so that drives a lot of cost. But it's also about being able to find the data, right? I have clients who have what I like to call data lakes, or giant warehouses where they have backup tapes for the last 15, 20 years, and they're very proud of it. But all that data opens them up to massive amounts of cost if they ever have to go back and get it. So practicing good information governance hygiene, and actually doing the disposable defensible destruction when it's time to do it, it'll pay off very much in the long run.
And Tara, when we were preparing for this, one of the issues that you had brought up was the idea of journaling capabilities. So there's sort of a double-edged sword. They're great for maybe that preservation step, but that they can also contribute to the digital mess.
Right, and so there are some industries that have to journal certain employees' mailboxes, right? There are some regulations that require that, but for the most part, if you have a journal functioning on, it's just, and you're not cleaning that up in any way, right? If there's no business need to keep someone on a journal, and you can require employees to manage their mailboxes, right? If you need the email as a business record, move it into another source. But to just journal, then you have to collect that entire journal, and then it's a huge volume of data to process and then muddle through, right? And a lot of times you can't do targeted collections because the employees can't see the journaling and they can't go in and sort of shift through for you. And so it's important to think about whether that's best for your company, whether it meets your needs, and whether you can manage the mailboxes in a different way.
And of course, all of this is tied into your bigger information governance strategy and other uses of your information. So it's not just, I just want to make the point that it's not just the downstream effects on eDiscovery, but with a digital doubling rate that it used to be 2 years, I guess it's now down under 1 year, that our data stores are doubling. We have this massive passive creation of data, and it's making it hard to find information just to do our day-to-day work, let alone eDiscovery. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and just to go back for a second, I saw a question flash up that was asking about what journaling is.
Oh, sorry.
And journaling is sort of the saving in the background, not where the custodian can see it, the email, so that no matter what the custodian does, if the custodian deletes the email or whatever they do with it, it doesn't affect that journal copy of the email, right, Tara? So that's what I saw a couple people asking that question.
Right. Even if you're double deleting emails, it's going into I'm going to say a secret bucket in the back that only the IT team can get to, and so the employees aren't aware that their emails actually aren't ever going away. It's just sitting there, and it's every email that ever came in or you sent.
And this journaling has expanded, right?
The journal. Sorry, I think the challenge of the journal is the fact that it's a big pile, right? You're just throwing everything into a big bin, and it just becomes this huge pile of stuff. Whereas there are other solutions out there that could do, proper archiving with proper deletion and proper storing of documents by custodians, right? By folders like the custodians do, and all the stuff that are easily searchable when you get into it in a discovery case. Whereas the journal is just a big pile of every email that's ever come in and out of your organization. It becomes difficult to do anything with.
And we've also added some journaling capabilities beyond eDiscovery too, right? In 0365, there's some, is that correct, Tara? I think you had mentioned this when we were.
Right, so Office 365 has a lot of options. One of them is in place legal hold, that if someone is placed on legal hold, you can put them on this, which essentially is a journaling. And so the back end, even if they are deleting and then double deleting, all of those emails are going into, I'm going to say a secret bucket in the back that you can collect from, except it's just everything. It's everything that hit them. And even if they think, and we're deleting the email because it had no business reason at all, right? It was from, ESPN and they're trying to double delete and get it out. You're going to then collect it during discovery because it's sitting in that journal, quote unquote.
So a lot has been written about the skyrocketing costs of eDiscovery, and we know that they can make up the majority of litigation expenses, upwards of, even up close to 80% of them. Now, there have been changes in the rules, proportionality, for example, to keep in check and as well as keep those costs in check, as well as improvements in processing. And the issue, though, that one of the things that we talked about was that even if you do a pretty good job of keeping your eDiscovery house in order, your information house in order, you may still need to get through a ton of data. So what are some of the other ways that you can reduce the cost, either by these rule changes and focused collections or something like that, as well as using technology? Tara, do you want to lead us on that one?
Sure. So I think that I find that most parties are being more cooperative about proportionality and are working together to sort of find a middle ground, because I think that most magistrate judges and the like are not happy when you go, running into the courthouse and one person is screaming that they want 100 custodians. I mean, I think parties are just being more cooperative on that and really thinking about what needs to be produced in a matter. And I think it's just, there is a large volume of data out there, and sometimes it can't be avoided. You have to collect it, right? Whether it's a government investigation or it's a huge MDL, or there's some reason why you can't just really pare down the volume of data. And I think it's doing smart discovery, right? I think it's negotiating with the other side, whether you prioritize custodial productions, really negotiating and testing your search terms, using technology, whether it's TAR or threading. Really just thinking about all the way from, targeted collections, meeting with the custodians, asking them where they keep the potentially responsive information, just, making sure that you're preserving all of the data, but you're just going to, in the first instance, collect only that which has been identified as potentially responsive, so that you're starting with a smaller bucket of data in the first instance, and then processing that, and then hopefully using technology to further whittle that down. And then, what is required for human eyes is a much smaller percentage of the data, which will reduce your costs, because that's a lot where the costs come in, is the human element of of this.
Andrea, do you have anything to add on this?
Just that I want Tara's opponents, because all my opponents are not being reasonable about, and really aren't taking proportionality into account. So we end up having to have those fights. But yeah, I agree with everything Tara just said. I think that the more you can scope and be really targeted in your discovery efforts, the better off it's going to be, and the less you're going to have a lawyer look at some point.
So just let's turn now to some of the risks of that poor IG creates on eDiscovery. So of course there are a myriad of other legal and regulatory risks of not having a good IG program in place. But what are some of the major eDiscovery related risks that are created by a poor IG program? Andrea, do you want to lead us on this one?
I think there are, a couple things. One is, if you're not getting rid of stuff, and when you should, oftentimes you can end up with documents that are so old and stale that the context of them is gone. So when they're pulled up in discovery, people can't explain the background in a way that would make them reasonable, as they were surely at the time. You know, in addition to that, you've got, you know, if you have poor IG, you may have gotten rid of stuff you were actually supposed to have kept, which can cause its own problems. And as you helpfully put up, we have this new federal rule, which actually was intended to sort of encourage people to be judicious and reasonable and get rid of stuff and give them some sort of comfort that, you know, it was a very high bar for them to get really nasty sanctions. So that's worked out pretty well. But I do have a lot of clients these days who are starting to look at their warehouses of backup tapes and things of that nature, and make defensible decisions about those things.
And it just out of, so in terms of, so making defensible decisions, so you, you know, if you're making a decision to delete these backup tapes, how do you, what's a way to make that defensible if you know you have, if you're say operating in a particularly litigious environment where you know, someone might say, hey, you should have gone back, or you should have gotten, you know, kept those tapes because you anticipated or were in the midst of litigation. How do you make those kinds of, you know, continuing reasonable IG decisions defensible if you are facing litigation?
Well, first you hire me or Tara. I've actually had, I represent a very large insurance company that is obviously engaged in litigation all the time, right? And they had a warehouse of backup tapes. And so what we ended up doing there was doing an assessment of their litigation profile and whether they'd ever gotten sanctioned for missing information, whether they had any missing custodians, whether they, you know, all those sorts of things. And then on the other side of it, what could we actually find in that giant warehouse full of backup tapes? Is it possible that if we were forced to go find that information, that we could find it? And if so, how much is that going to cost? And is that reasonable and proportionate? And when we went through that whole analysis, what we found is that they hadn't been accused of spoliation. They didn't have any outstanding custodians in any of their, you know, really significant litigations that, you know, were missing data. And on the other side, it was going to be nearly impossible, barring an incredible sort of sampling exercise across the 2 million backup tapes, to find anything in there, because, you know, these tapes were so old that a lot of the records that went with them are gone. So. And in the end, it's a risk-based decision, but, you know, you paper it, you do the analysis, and you come up with a reasonable answer. And
that contemporaneous documentation is key, right?
Super key.
Tara, do you have anything to add here on just what kind of risks does poor IG create in eDiscovery? You have anything to add?
Right, and so I think it goes to when Andrea said, you know, there's these data lakes out there, and the clients don't know what's in them, how to find them. You know, maybe no one's around anymore to tell you exactly where that data was stored, and then you think you don't have it, and then you represent to the other side that we don't have it anymore. It was, you know, in normal course, there wasn't a legal hold in place, record retention expired, we got rid of it. And then something happens, right? You either, a witness gets deposed and says, oh yeah, we have that. Or there's another document, an email that goes out that's referring to some repository. And then, oops, yeah, there it is. Here you have been able to find it. I don't think it's not like, you know, you have to worry about sanctions or anything. It just allows the other side to come back to you and say, well, what else did you miss, right? Now you've opened the door to, like, you know, and even if you say that's it, you know, so that's one of the risks.
So digging into your discovery process. If
discovery on discovery.
Then you have a 30B6 on all your ESI, and now you're like spending hours prepping a witness. You know, and so that's one of the risks of not having your IG house in order, is that you don't know where to find it, and then something happens like that, even with your best efforts.
So we have a question that just came up. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrea. Did you have some?
No.
Oh, sorry. We had a question that came up. My understanding is that organizations regularly search backups. There could be an issue with disposing of these backups on a shorter disposition schedule, since they would be retained for a period defined by the retention schedule. Have you come across this?
Yeah, so if I'll answer this if that's okay.
Sure.
That is a little bit different, right? If it depends on whether it's a backup or an archive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Backup tapes are for disaster recovery. That's their whole mission. And so, you know, they shouldn't be using them as some sort of archive where they go back and search all the time. And I think that's pretty expensive anyway, so I wouldn't recommend it. Archives are sort of an active system that you can go into and look for stuff and pull it out. And yes, those are subject to, you know, certain retention schedules, but you know, absent any regulatory or legal reason to preserve those, you can set whatever retention schedule you want on them.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Yes.
Answer the question.
Absolutely. So I think we've touched on this already, but this idea, so the rule that we have of the fear of sanctions used to be a major driver for discovery costs, people doing, you know, massive overpreservation. Do you think that that the rule change has really lifted some of the burden of that? And, you know, have they really made it possible? I think we've talked about this a little bit, made it possible to, you know, do upstream some good IG, if not perfect. So this idea that, you know, eDiscovery doesn't have to be perfection, so it allows us to do things upstream because some of this intent burden, using intent, has lifted some of the burden of the risk of sanctions. Do you agree with that?
Are you asking me?
Oh,
or
sorry,
Tara?
Tara. Sorry.
Oh, you're on
You're
mute.
muted.
Sorry, and I think, so just like I said about proportionality, I
Mhm.
think that this change to the rule was really beneficial.
Mhm.
Hopefully Andrea agrees with me on this one, but
Yeah.
I do think that there's less of, you know, it's less stressful, right? Because there's been plenty of times where, you know, I always say preservation is the most important point of this, right? Even if you're keeping it somewhere during the life of the litigation, maybe we don't have to collect it, but preserve it. But there are always instances when something happens, whether it's a bad actor or whether someone inadvertently deletes something. They didn't mean to do it. It happened. They didn't understand technology. They didn't understand what they were doing, and we lost data.
Mhm.
And I think now I feel protected by the rules to go the other side and say, here's what happened, and we're going to make it right, right? Because as long as it's not intentional, as long as you can make them whole again by replacing the data in some way, and there's tons of ways to do that, right? Someone inadvertently deletes emails.
Mhm.
Maybe you find the other 10 individuals in their group that they email with them, you know, most often, and you collect their emails and sort of recreate that mailbox and say to the opposing side, look, here, you have as good as we can get. And most judges are going to think that that's okay. I mean, I think that this rule of, you know, intentional and not intentional and making the other side whole again by trying to recreate what was lost, I feel that it's given us some protection, but I'm interested to see if Andrea agrees with me.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with you. I think a lot of clients now are much more comfortable because they were so worried about sort of getting caught in that negligence trap where, oops, you know, what you did was negligent or grossly negligent, and here's your adverse inference, right? So they were just keeping a lot of stuff like backup tapes to, you know, be an insurance policy against that because the sanctions could be so massive. And so now I think they're much more comfortable with that.
So just for people who aren't familiar with this, there used to be a jurisdictional split on the level of intentionality to get some of the more severe sanctions, and that's what this rule was changing. So we've talked about the increased costs and risks of discovery, but the average business owner of information isn't going to experience some of those effects. Litigation isn't usually in someone's cost center, and they're not always the ones wrangling with these issues in court. So they tend to feel the pain with the business disruption. How does poor IG lead to increased business disruption during discovery? Andrea, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, I think the big issue is that if people don't know where the data is, you have to keep going back to them. You have to keep asking questions. You have to keep, you know, following up on leads to find the things that have been requested in discovery. And so it takes a lot more time. Whereas, you know, if people have been managing their data well, they know where it's located, you can really do discovery with you know, a very short, to the point, you know, interview with the custodian that takes half an hour at tops, and then you don't have to bother them again.
Tara, do you have anything to add on that? You're on mute, by the way.
Sorry. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that, you know, for some clients who have a large litigation or investigation portfolio and the same data sources keep being implicated in discovery, your pharmaceutical company, your marketing materials, your sales materials, your regulatory file, right? And so to have a process in place for those data sources, working with those business owners, so that every time a litigation comes up, you don't keep having to go back to them over and over again, but instead you sort of create I call them like frequent flyer lists. Like, here's the 10, 15 sources that we usually go to in our typical litigations. And you sort of learn those sources. You have like a, you know, 1 or 2 meetings with the business owners. You understand the systems, what its retention is. You know, you have an ongoing relationship with them. So if something's going to change about that system, they come talk to you, right? It's going to migrate. They're going to move data off. They come speak with the legal department before they do that. But then it eliminates every single time a matter comes up, you're calling those people into the conversation, right? It sort of becomes more of an automated process to make it efficient for everybody, including the business owners.
It's not a de novo process each time, right? So that's it. That's a great strategy. Just to tie this back again, we've been talking about this downstream, you know, IG being upstream and eDiscovery being downstream, this left-right distinction. We just want to clarify here with this that we shouldn't think of information in this way. We want to look at, if you look at the definition here, it's meant to be an overarching and coordinating strategy. And though these models show this left-right, downstream, almost like time-sensitive, you know, life cycle, these are really meant to be conceptual, not literally requiring a linear or waterfall approach. And we're certainly advocating, and I want to open this up again for comment from Andrea and Tara and Frederick. We're advocating a more holistic approach, that you need to be, you know, considering the entire information life cycle of a document or a piece of information from the beginning, from the moment of its creation and capture throughout its final disposition. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's brilliant. It's a great idea.
Thank you.
I highly recommend it. No,
Iterative, yeah.
I mean, I think one of the challenges that a lot of my clients face is that, you know, they are where they are right now, right? And they haven't managed the life cycle of their documents. And so they don't know how to get into that and how to sort of tackle it, because it seems like it's a giant mountain, and there's, you know, it's hard to climb it and in any defensible way. So, you know, a lot of times what we'll recommend is start doing life cycle management now, like, you know, on a going forward basis, and we'll worry about the old stuff separately, but, you know, start getting into that and start, you know, coding, you know, as you're creating documents, coding them for, you know, what their retention period is and all that sort of stuff. So
like a stop the bleed approach, stop the bleed and then.
Turn off the faucet, and then you can also bail out the tub.
Agreed.
100% agree. And I think that some clients get so frozen by the like it's a huge landscape, you know, it's like, and they don't want to start. And I say the same thing, just start somewhere. As long as you can just start somewhere and just leave the rest to the rainy day, but just start going this point forward, especially with the explosion of data, start managing it now.
So in the blurb describing this webinar, we had admonished people, don't wait until you are in the midst of eDiscovery to find out that there are gaping holes in your information governance program. This sort of Swiss cheese is representative of that. I know that you work with, both of you work with some very sophisticated clients who are repeat players and have seen litigation and eDiscovery and have certainly cleaned up their processes. But do you still find people are caught off guard by what they find in eDiscovery, and that they find, you know, that there are major holes in their IG process? Tara, do you want to lead us on that one?
Sure. So, and I have worked with some clients who haven't, you know, lucky for them, just haven't had a large volume of litigation or an investigation, and then they get hit with one. right? And they're not used to it. They might have some employment matters or some small contract disputes, but not a huge litigation or investigation. And then it happens, and it's inefficient and extremely expensive because there's no process in place, whether they don't really have a good legal hold protocol in place, they don't have any internal collection capabilities, they don't know where the data is. I mean, a lot of issues come to play, but they get through it, right? The productions are made, and then hindsight, there's this whole, what was that spend? Why was the spend like that? What is going on? What are we supposed to be doing? And so I have conducted, I call them IG assessments for a lot of clients, where we basically go in. I think this is important, and a lot of times it's the aftermath of what I just explained, but it's for a client to understand, you know, what is the process? What were the pain points during that experience for them, from the lawyer side, from the IT side, from the HR side? I mean, you know, did we have employees who had left the company and we hadn't retained their media, and we should have, because they were subject to the legal hold? I mean, the entire gamut of,
so holes in that offboarding process.
That whole process, and just sitting down and discussing with them about, you know, do you want to have an internal capability for eDiscovery in any way, or do you want to outsource it? And if you outsource it, who do you want your vendors to be? Do you want, you know, the Cadillac, or do you just want someone who can come in and sweep through because you're not a big player in the litigation space? And telling them about best practices and, you know, the cases and what they should be doing, and giving them a time frame for, here, we you know, suggest you do these 3 things right away. This is a risk to you. This is the middle of the road. You should probably do these relatively soon in the next year. And then back here, we suggest them, but maybe you never want to get to them. And making sure that they have someone who owns this process and who keeps this program going if they do implement it, so that the next time they get hit with a huge matter, they have a process in place, and it's not people scrambling and, you know, calls all weekend and all night because we have no idea where the data is. It's just sort of having a process, an eDiscovery process in place. And part of that is overlaying the entire thing is IG, because of course, everywhere, you know, all along the way, you need to know where the data is and how to get it out, et cetera.
We have a,
sorry, go ahead. I agree with Tara. We see that a lot with our customers, where, you know, they're wanting to get that process in-house. They're wanting to go and have an eDiscovery and IG tied together, but they just don't know how yet right now, right? And I think is one of the challenges is what are the steps? What do I need to put in? What are the processes? Who needs to be in charge? Do I need 1 person, 10 people, right? Or all of these questions that come up, and they're looking at it going, okay, now I'll bring in the tools, but I need that business process to support it around it. And I think that's one of the challenges that our customers are being faced with, yeah.
So what are, and I'll open this up also if you want to add anything to what's been said too, but what are some of the major issues you've spotted during eDiscovery that need to be taken into account in IG, Andrea? Like what's your, what are some major sticky points that you found? Not all of them, just a couple.
Yeah, I think just massive over retention. That's the thing we see time and time again. And some clients coming in and proudly saying, you know, oh, we don't do any sort of document deletion. And I sort of, my heart starts to, and I'm like, after we finish with this, we need to have another conversation about.
And they're proud of it, right? They're like, we never delete anything. And you're like, no, that's not done.
That's not good. That's not good. And there's some real risk here now, not only on the litigation side, which obviously is super important, but, you know, with cybersecurity issues, I mean, right now, and I think it was the FBI or something just recently reported that there's a huge uptick in data breaches. And the great thing about IG is that if you get rid of it, it's gone, right? Nobody can steal it. But if it's around and it gets stolen by hackers, God forbid they either use it or post it to the internet or do any number of things that can be really devastating to the company. So that's also a problem. And then I'll mention one other one because I'm a data privacy geek, and that is that, you know, there are privacy laws now, both in the US and abroad, that require you to do good data hygiene and get rid of stuff that no longer has a business purpose. And in the EU, they just recently issued a $14.3 million fine against $1 million fine against a German company that had kept rental applications for years and years and years back. So there are some significant cost consequences even beyond eDiscovery, although that's what we're here to talk about.
Okay, just before we hand this over to Frederick, just to give a few words about NetGovern, I do want to talk about sort of the elephant in the room, which is the pandemic that we're all working under, and everyone is, you know, spontaneously now working from home, and you may or may not have been, your company may or may not have been well equipped to do that. So they're you know, unexpectedly working remotely and finding all kinds of kerfuffles with their management of information. So what are you expecting from, what are the two of you expecting from an IG perspective, and which might be found in the context of eDiscovery, that are the issues that are going to emerge from this? Tara, do you want to open us with this?
Sure. So I think it's important to, hopefully before the pandemic, you had good user policies in place, storage policies in place, right? Where you instructed all of your employees to make sure that they're saving company data on company devices, company servers, and that you're reminding people to do that, right? So they're not working from home on, you know, their shared family computer, creating and saving documents, because if those documents become subject to litigation, you're going to have to collect from that computer. And not only because of discovery, but like Andrea just said, there's privacy reasons, there's, you know, security breach reasons. Like you just want your company data to be stored on your servers. Mm-hmm. I think that's an issue now because we're all working remotely. I'm certain that in the future, opposing parties will be asking more about text messaging, third-party apps, because they know that we're not sitting down the hall from each other talking in person, right? That everything has been moved remotely. We're all doing Zooms, there's chatting in Zooms, all of this. And so I think it's reminding everyone of ongoing, you know, active legal holds, if there's any out there, reminding people to use company servers and devices for business needs, not using third-party apps if that's part of your policy, and just enforcing that and reminding people.
Andrea, do you have anything to add on that?
The only thing I would add to that, because I think all of that is absolutely spot on, is the paper documents that are created. You know, I like to live in a digital world, right? But during the pandemic, I've had to sign things. I've had to sign agreements. I've had to, you know, and so when that happens, I have to print them out, and then they have to get scanned and sent back. And that document that now is a document. Now it's a duplicate from what I scanned, right? So I don't have to keep it, but I need to dispose of it properly and make sure that it gets shredded and not just thrown into the trash. And just making sure that they're not lying around too, from a data security perspective.
So it's a security issue, but also then I'm hearing also in part of what Tara was saying, you know, a remediation issue too, that just sort of finding all of this at the end of the pandemic when we go back to normal.
And because a lot of people are starting to use new tools, there's got to be a thought at this point of okay, we're using these new tools. How am I going to collect from these tools, right? If I'm going to have litigation, is the stuff that's in there, you know, discoverable, and how do I manage that? I think that's one of the key issues that at least we're seeing. Yeah.
Okay. That's true.
So, Frederick, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few words about NetGovern. So just tell me when you need me to advance the slide. So.
Yep, will do. Well, NetGovern is an information governance software company. So we develop software for information governance. Move to the next slide. And what we've seen, like our panelists today in the market, is really an evolution, kind of a major change, shift in eDiscovery over the last few years, as well as information governance, because of data growth, because of compliance, new requirements, right? We talked about GDPR and all the privacy regulations, security threats, a lot of hacking happening. I guess crooks have moved to COVID and remote work as well. Cost pressures, right? A lot of organizations have to put and cut costs, and then the remote work that comes in, which is really demanding. So we're here to help as an organization. Next slide. You know, we're here to help with the security teams around information governance, the compliance team around information governance, and also litigation teams, right? And we're really here to answer 4 questions. One is where is your data? who has access to that data, how long do we keep that data, and what's inside those documents that we keep, right? That's our goal, is to help the organization answer those questions. Next. So two important piece on the legal front that we help with, in-place search and collection and legal hold. So the idea is you connect all your data sources, have the ability to go through a single pane of glass, right? A single search UI, be able to look at the data wherever it is and start to do consistent searches, consistent collection, as well as consistent legal hold across all those platforms without having to wiggle around with different sets of tools without knowing what's going to happen with that data. Next. So key capabilities, we call that smart collection. So the idea with smart collection is having the ability to run search in place. You don't have to copy the data before you actually start reviewing and doing collaborative work, and the early case assessment, the early investigation into your cases, and really minimize the downstream cost of eDiscovery and litigation. So that's, from an eDiscovery perspective, how we're here to help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Frederick. And let's open it up for some questions. So this question one here. So oftentimes legal and IG teams aren't collaborating until litigation happens, which often creates issues regarding data governance. How, as an IG professional, do you make sure you're included in these conversations? How about we start with Andrea?
That's
Any
a
advice?
really good question. I mean, having never been in-house, let me start by making that caveat. I would think the best thing to do would just to find out who the eDiscovery folks are in your company's legal department, and sit down and have a cup of coffee and engage in this a little bit. Most of those folks, in my estimation, and are very interested in IG and would be delighted to talk about those issues and work with you. I have colleagues on the eDiscovery side all the time, talking about their concerns around IG. So I think they would be delighted to do so.
Tara, do you have any thoughts on this one?
No, I agree. I think that reaching out and just getting to know individuals, and most times they would be just, again, I haven't been in-house, but just having worked with clients and legal departments, that they would welcome that. We always welcome IT to come speak to legal, so that we can make sure that we know where the data is going, and sort of having that collaborative, I do think that while IG and eDiscovery need to intersect and overlap, IG decisions shouldn't necessarily be made out of fear of litigation.
Agreed.
If
So
that makes sense.
over a bigger strategic approach to it rather than this.
But you handle your data for your business needs, your regulatory needs, your record retention, all of that, not out of the fear of discovery. And I think there's a lot of times that gets muddled up. And so I always remind my clients of that. Don't set that policy just because you're afraid there's going to be a litigation downstream. Don't do that.
And having been in-house on the IG side, we a couple times, we certainly, I haven't seen in-house the position where we didn't collaborate with legal. IG and legal always worked hand in hand, and again, it was we did take that approach of managing information according to the overall business, legal and regulatory needs, not just handling one specific risk, eDiscovery. So the next question is, eDiscovery is mostly reactionary and IG is mostly proactive. I wonder if you guys agree with that. When we have a large scale litigation or discovery situation, many organizations don't have the time for implementing an IG program. Time is of the essence, and hence the priority is to get through the litigation. What do you say to these organizations? How does it impact the IG related discussions within the organization? Andrea, do you want to take that?
Sure. I believe that in the middle of the litigation is probably not the time to start those conversations. That being said, there's some companies that are always in litigation. And if you're always in litigation, you shouldn't, wait around for a time when you're not in order to start these programs. But you have to be mindful of the fact that you know, we have some preservation obligations that run up against, you know, doing defensible disposition all the time. So, Tara, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that I think that for some clients, discovery is reactionary, but not for all. So I think yeah, I don't really know that I have much to add on that one.
For some, it's seen as do you think it's seen as you know, it's part of doing business?
Yeah.
Right. We have some clients
because they're serial litigants.
Serial litigants, and they have, that's all, I mean, that's half of what they do every day. There's 17, 25 active monitors. Some of them are huge MDLs going on at the same time. And so it's their life, it's their business, it's what they do, right?
It seems like that, like just even something similar, you know, inspections that happen in a pharma or biotech company, they're similar in the kinds of production requirements you're doing and being able to find information. It just seems like it's the same kind of issue. If you prepare for it in advance, it minimizes that disruption to the day-to-day. So so this is an interesting one. I want to open this up to Frederick too, because it says when doing eDiscovery, and all of you actually, but when doing eDiscovery and trying to do collection of the potentially responsive records, is it better to move the records to a designated location or copy them? And I want to open it as there's a third possibility to do some preservation in place. So do you have any thoughts on that, Frederick?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a big discussion last week on that topic with the ACE heads. The reality is there's no simple answer. The preservation in place is an easy way to keep data when you have very large litigation and you don't know what's going to come up. But when you have a good feel for hey, this is the data set that I need, you probably want to make a copy somewhere and know that it's there and be comfortable that, hey, I have this data, it's here, you know, it's protected, nothing's going to happen from an IT system perspective, because the in-place preservation has a whole bunch of implication in terms of a whole bunch of people, right, in IT and that need to make sure that things work properly to make it happen. So that, you know, that's my thought is yeah, when you're at a point where you get a good feel for what the data is, you should make a copy. You should pull it from those systems. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't delete it from the systems and move it somewhere else. People still need to do their job and continue to work as business, right? But yeah.
Well, certainly with system data, if you would be locking a system that's an active system people are using, that could really gum up the works, especially if you're a serial player here.
It becomes a problem, right? And I've seen that, right, where people lock down systems and that's just counterproductive from a business standpoint.
Andrea, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm actually a big believer in place preservation, but it's a risk analysis, right? I mean, locking down a system doesn't mean that you can't put more stuff on it. It just means that you don't delete the stuff that's there already, right? So it doesn't as badly impact things. But, you know, for 95% of the cases we're in, there's no bad actor. There's no, you know, janitorial system other than email, which, you know, we deal with. And so in-place preservation makes a lot of sense for two reasons. One is that if you collect it early on, you might have to collect again because there's more there. So you have to go back. And then also there was another reason. What was it? Collect again. Oh, and you might never have to collect because, you know, a lot of these cases get settled before we ever get to the point of discovery or get to the point of collection, I should say. And sometimes the custodian themselves might not be on the priority list. Maybe they're a backup custodian.
So we did sort of touch on you know, the idea of, you know, creating copies and things like that. Tara, I was wondering if you could give us some thoughts on governing our production data or our eDiscovery data. So you're creating copies of it. You are eventually sharing it with opposing counsel, vendors, co-counsel, and so on. You know, certainly decisions have to be made in terms of governing that information as well. Tara, did you hear me? Sorry.
You froze for a second, so
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
I missed your, yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. So it was just in terms of creating the, wow, that it was, I gave the answer to life, the universe, and everything just then. And no, so we were talking about sort of the creation of copies. So creating a copy and preserving the copy. So we're creating information, eDiscovery information during the eDiscovery process. So we're doing things where they were sending it in some cases to vendors, to opposing counsel, to co-counsel, et cetera. And, we're duplicating data. We are, sending it all over the place, and it's some of the most sensitive information because it's the documents in a litigation. So that information needs to be governed as well. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about some of the concerns around that and how you manage those.
Right. So I have a lot of clients recently who have been focusing on this. And it's because, 10 years ago, we sent the data everywhere, right? So there was huge class actions, MDLs, they had their data going to this vendor for OCR, this vendor for objective coding, wherever. All the law firms had copies, plaintiffs had copies, then the litigation settles, and then the data is still out there. It's still sitting there to this day, right? And so it's also cleaning up not your own IG house, but wherever else the data was sent to, right? Having a protective order in place that requires, at the conclusion of a matter and 30 days thereafter, the opposing party will agree to certify that they've deleted the copies of your client's data, and then just making sure that the data isn't being sent to, 15 vendors and 15 outside law firms, and they're keeping track of it, because any of those people can get breached, right? It's not just having multiple copies of your data all over the place, but what if that vendor gets breached and your client should have track of where their data is stored. If you have a vendor with your data on it, you don't need to have 5 of your outside law firms creating their own copies and their own databases in-house. Just give them access to that vendor's database, right? It sort of helps you to keep your external IG house in order, so you can make sure when those documents and productions are no longer needed for that litigation, they're either destroyed or just handled in a way that the client is keeping track of it. I think that's really, really important.
And what about, you touched on this, privacy and breach notification. So you send it to opposing counsel, they have your information now, and they're breached. Do you work those kinds of breach notifications into
we just started to include that in our protective order, what we have for a while, but to ask opposing counsel to let us know either who their vendor is, or to notify us, within however many days, if their vendor has a breach. Because it's our client data sitting on there, and so we need to know if our client's data has been breached.
Sorry, Andrea, you look like you might have had a comment on that one. Some thoughts on that.
Yeah, we also have data security provisions in our protective orders, because they're an order, so that helps, when it comes time to do notification. And it just lists really reasonable things that they should be doing anyway, because there's the story, I'm not sure exactly who this happened to, but where a lawyer produced information to their opponents, and then their opponents' document management system happened to be Google Docs. And so all their, private information that was produced in the litigation got indexed to the web. Super awesome. And you just don't want that sort of thing to happen for our clients' private, proprietary, oftentimes trade secret information. And I often will get initial pushback, but once we sort of talk through the various provisions that are in there, they usually realize that arguing that this is unreasonable in front of the judge is probably not going to go well.
That reinforces the fact of collecting as little as you can, right? Make sure you have what you need, but collecting and moving around as little as you can, and really, getting it as early as possible to the source of data.
I just want, with the sort of, back in, we do vendor screenings, of course, and, making sure where's our vendor putting this information. Do you, what are your thoughts on sort of opposing counsel screening, as in asking them, do you ask those kinds of questions? Where's this data going? It just seems like I would expect a lot of pushback on that.
Only for the most critical data will I ask that question. We had data from a client that was highly, highly sensitive, and we knew that it was going directly to their expert. And so, you know, we had discussions about that.
Mhm.
But other than that, I usually don't. We just have our data security provisions in there, and, you know, we expect them to abide by them just like they expect us to.
Okay, we are coming up on the top of the hour. I'm going to take one more question to see if we can get it in there. If people, can you guys hang on for just one or two more minutes? So it seems that the question is, it seems that the major reason given by some firms for over retention is that legal requires us to, even though there are myriad reasons for retention of all manner of documents. How do you address the argument, and who is supposed to be the driver of that, IG or legal? So I think it's who's driving the decision to keep it or not keep it. Is it IG or legal?
I think it's
Or
legal.
Legal.
Well, I think it's both. I think it's both.
Okay.
That wasn't helpful. I mean, I think that there's IG
Yes.
is, you know, there's regulations and requirements. There's certain laws that require you to keep data for certain periods of time, right? So that's black and white. And then it's the legals. You know, there's a
business
risk analysis, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there are a lot of people who say keep everything in conversation. If you have like an Andrea or me who come in and say, well, you don't want to do that, and here's all the reasons why. So I think it's both, right? But I think it's ultimately probably legal's decision. Andrea, do you agree? I mean, they're going to be the drivers.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see a lot of cases with our customers where legal is stepping away from that decision, and they're saying, no, business should decide, because they know when they don't, when they don't need the data anymore, right? And they're saying, okay, business line should decide when they delete the data, and then the rest is legal can say, give their opinion, they're part of the decision, but they're kind of stepping aside and saying, no, we're not going to make that call because we don't know how long this data is required from a business standpoint.
I've seen a collaborative process too, where, you know, you have the business owners, the IG folks saying, here's what the retention period is. The business people are saying, yes, there's no exception to this, you know, driving in opposition to the retention, and then legal is giving a sign off to and saying, yes, it's also not under hold, so it's released from the, you know, released for, you know, defensible remediation. I mean, I would think you'd need all of those parties involved to say go. Andrea, you had commented me to.
No. I absolutely agree. You know, legal drives it from the preservation perspective, and oftentimes they're also sort of tasked with revising the retention schedule. So they're involved in that way. But, you know, at the end of the day, if there's not a legal or regulatory requirement for it, then it absolutely should be driven by the business and what the business value of that information is.
Okay, we are actually over time, so I just wanted to wrap this up. And first I'd like to thank all of our panelists in today's webinar, and to thank you for your continuing service to this community and sharing knowledge with us. Our next webinar will be announced very soon. Before we close, I'd like to remind you to become a professional member of ARMA International and take time to invest in yourself. ARMA has an array of resources that are available for you: white papers, training articles in our magazine, and webinars like this, and much, much more. On behalf of our speakers and the wonderful folks at NetGovern who gave time and money to sponsor programming like this webinar today, and all of us at ARMA International, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and wish you the best in all your information endeavors. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you so much.